Hello and welcome to the Microsoft Intune enrollment experiences with the Windows 11 video. My name is Paolo Matarazzo and I'm a program manager in the Intune product group. This video is a collection of walkthroughs showing the end-user enrollment experiences of Windows 11 devices with Microsoft Intune. Since we already covered the configuration of the Intune service to enable all these scenarios in previous videos, if you're interested in learning more about it, please follow the links in the description below. This video is divided in three parts. In the first part, we're gonna look at the enrollment of personally owned devices or bring your own devices. In the second part, we're gonna look at the enrollment of corporate owned devices with user interaction, meaning that the end users have to take an action to get their devices enrolled into the Intune service. In the third part, we're gonna look at the enrollment of corporate-owned devices with bulk enrollment, meaning that the enrollment into the Intune service can be automated or performed in an unattended fashion. In this first part, which is enrollment of personally owned devices, we're gonna look at three different walkthroughs. We're gonna look at the enrollment using Modern App Sign-In. Then we will look at Add Work or School Account, and lastly, we will look at the enrollment via Company Portal. In all these scenarios, the devices will be registered in Azure Active Directory and then automatically enrolled into the Intune service with user affinity, which means that the end users will be bound to the device from an Intune perspective. Users will still be able to sign into these devices with either their personal Microsoft account or a local account, but at the same time they will get single sign-on to any applications that are tied to their Azure Active Directory tenant, for example Microsoft 365 apps. In this first walkthrough we have Alison signing in to her device using her Microsoft account. She types her PIN and she opens Edge. To have separate browsing data between her personal account and her school account, Alison decides to add a profile to Microsoft Edge. As part of this process, she signs in with her school account. The benefit of doing so is that she can access her synced favorites, collections, and browsing history. After typing her credentials, Alison is prompted with the Modern Authentication sign-in screen. We have already seen this dialog box in previous videos, but let's briefly describe it as Alison can take three different paths here. She could select No, sign in to this app only, in which case Alison can start using Edge and getting access to her synchronized settings. Nothing else would happen to the device. A second option for Alison would be to remove the flag Allow my organization to manage my device and select OK. In this case, what happens is that Alison gets all Edge synchronized settings and her device gets registered in Azure Active Directory. This would provide Alison with the added benefit of single sign-on to all the applications that are registered in her Azure Active Directory tenant. The last option is that Alison selects OK, keeping Allow my organization to manage my device flagged. The end result in this case is that Alison not only gets her Edge settings synchronized to this device and her device registered in Azure Active Directory, but the device would also be enrolled in Intune, getting managed by Alison's school. So in this case, she selects OK. Now the device is getting registered and enrolled in Intune. Settings and applications targeted to either Alison or the device are getting applied by Intune. We can easily verify that the device is indeed managed by Intune by looking at the settings application. Here we can select Accounts and select Access Work or School. Here we see that Alison's account is connected to the device and that the device is managed by the school district. By selecting Info, we can verify which policies and applications are pushed by Intune. Now Minecraft is already installed, so we can open it, and Minecraft Education Edition is one of those applications that are tied to the Azure Active Directory tenant of Alison, so she gets single sign-on to Minecraft Education Edition, making it very easy for Alison to start using this application. Now, in this second walkthrough, we're going to look at the enrollment using Add Work or School Account. Alison again is signing into her device with their Microsoft account, but in this case she decides to open Settings. From here she selects Accounts, Access Work or School, and here really she has two options. She could use Add Work or School Account and select Connect, or select Enroll Only in Device Management. This second option would not register this device in Azure Active Directory, providing single sign-on capabilities, so Alison decides to select Connect. She has to authenticate using her Azure Active Directory credentials. And after signing, the device will get first registered in Azure Active Directory and automatically enrolled in Intune. Settings and applications will start to be applied to this device, and this may take some time depending on how many settings and apps you have deployed. As we saw before, we can always verify which settings and apps are pushed by Intune, since they will appear in this list. We can also verify that, like in the previous example, we have single sign-on to any Azure Active Directory connected applications, for example, Minecraft Education Edition. And this brings us to the third and last walkthrough for Bring Your Own Devices. In this case, the enrollment into Intune will be done using Company Portal. Alison signs in to her device using her Microsoft account and opens the Microsoft Store. Here she's going to search for the application Company Portal, and she will install the application. Once the application is installed, Alison opens it and she authenticates. Here we have the same modern authentication dialog box that we saw in the first walkthrough with Microsoft Edge. Alison selects OK, and the device is now registered in Azure Active Directory and enrolled in Intune. The benefit of using Company Portal for Alison is that now she can do self-servicing and installing any applications that have been made available to her by the IT department. Applications and settings are being pushed by Intune, and we can verify that the Minecraft Education Edition is installed. Alison opens it, and as before, she gets single sign-on to it. This concludes the first part of this video, where we covered the enrollment of Bring Your Own Devices. In this second part, we will be covering the enrollment of corporate-owned devices with user interaction. In the first walkthrough, we're looking at the out-of-box experience of Windows 11, which brings a refreshed user interface and more options compared to Windows 10. In the second walkthrough, we will enroll our device using Windows Autopilot User-driven mode, and in the third walkthrough, we will be looking at the Windows Autopilot pre-provisioning process. In all these scenarios, the devices will be Azure AD joined and then automatically enrolled in the Intune service with user affinity. Users will be able to sign into these devices with their Azure Active Directory account and getting single sign-on to any applications tied to their Azure Active Directory tenant. Looking at the new out-of-box experience in Windows 11, here we're turning the device on for the first time. Similarly to Windows 10, in Windows 11 we are prompted to select our region. Then we have the prompt for the keyboard layout, and then the prompt for an additional keyboard layout. After which we need to connect to the internet. In this case, we are connecting to a Wi-Fi network. We type the password and select Next. The device will check for critical updates, and in the next screen we have this new option to rename the device, which makes it very convenient for the end user. Note that if you rename the device, there will be a reboot, and then it will proceed with the next part of the out-of-box experience. For simplicity, we're going to skip this part. Now we're prompted to pick between a Bring Your Own Device scenario or a corporate-owned device scenario. We select the second option, after which we must authenticate using an Azure Active Directory account. We type our credentials, and after the authentication, we must accept the end-user license agreement. And now the device is joining Azure Active Directory and automatically enrolling in Intune. Applications and settings that are targeted to either the device or to the end user are starting to be applied from Intune. And this may take some time depending on how many applications and settings you have configured. Note that by default, the user who's performing the Azure eJoin will become a local administrator on this device. Moving to the second walkthrough of corporate-owned devices with end-user interaction, here we are looking at Windows Autopilot. In this case, the device has been registered in Windows Autopilot and assigned a user-driven mode profile. Let's now look at how the out-of-box experience is different for Alison compared to the previous walkthrough. Alison is turning the device on for the first time, and, like before, she must select a region, a keyboard, and an additional keyboard. Then she connects to the internet via Wi-Fi. Note that if this device was hardwired, with Autopilot we could automatically configure region and keyboard, making this experience even simpler. After the device is connected to the internet, it detects that it has an Autopilot profile assigned. As you can see, the device belongs to Alison's school. Alison types her username and her password. Like we saw in the previous walkthrough, the device is now Azure AD joined and enrolled in Intune. Applications and settings are delivered to the device, and this again may take a little bit of time depending on how many applications and settings you have in place. This out-of-box experience was much simpler compared to the standard one for Alison. She wasn't prompted to rename her device, she didn't have to pick between personal or corporate device ownership, she didn't even have to accept the end-user license agreement. The only thing left to do for Alison was to type her username and her password. Last but not least, this Autopilot profile was configured to set Alison as a standard user, instead of being a local administrator, making this device more secure. Now we're going to look at the third and last scenario for corporate-owned devices with end-user interaction, Autopilot pre-provisioning. This scenario is an improvement of the standard Autopilot User-driven mode, the one that we just described. Since the device will go through a pre-provisioning phase where it is joined to Azure Active Directory and pre-enrolled in Intune, applications and settings can be applied in this phase before the device is delivered to the end user. In this case, the device has been registered in Windows Autopilot and assigned a pre-provisioning profile. The device is turned on for the first time in a staging or provisioning facility by either an OEM, a reseller, or maybe a technician in the organization's IT department. The technician will ensure that the device is hardwired and connected to the internet. And once the device is in out-of-box experience, the technician taps the window key 5 times. Now the technician can select the option Pre-provision with Windows Autopilot and select Next. The device retrieves the Autopilot profile, indicating that the device belongs to the school. The technician selects Next. In the next phase, the device will automatically join Azure Active Directory and enroll in Intune. The technician doesn't have to provide any credentials, so the device can proceed on its own. Applications and settings that have been targeted to the device will be installed. After some time, the device will complete this pre-provisioning phase, and if successful, it will display a green checkbox indicating that the deployment completed. Now the technician selects the Reseal button, which places the device back in the out-of-box experience and shuts down. The device can now be shipped to the end user. Now the device is in the hands of Alison, and she turns it on. Ideally, this device will automatically connect to the network. Maybe the Wi-Fi was configured during the pre-provisioning phase. Alison is prompted to type her username and her password. The device will go through a quick phase of final setup, where additional applications and settings may get installed. After Alison signs in and her profile is loaded, we see that Alison's experience is nicer than before. All customizations are already on the device. Some applications may get installed after Alison signs in, because they require the user profile to be loaded, for example Teams or progressive web apps. But nevertheless, this experience is much nicer for the end user. Note that Autopilot pre-provisioning has hardware requirements like TPM2 and hardware attestation that must be met, so ensure that your devices can meet these requirements before trying this scenario. This was the last walkthrough for the end-user enrollment experiences for corporate-owned devices. In the third and last part of this video, we will be covering the enrollment of corporate-owned devices without user interaction, starting with the provisioning package enrollment and then looking at Windows Autopilot Self-deploying mode. In these scenarios, the devices will be Azure AD joined and then enrolled in the Intune service without user affinity. These enrollment types do not tie a device to a particular user, so they're a good option for shared devices or kiosks, for example. These enrollment types are also very common in education, as they enable large-scale rollouts without any end-user involvements. Users will still be able to sign into these devices with their Azure Active Directory accounts and getting single sign-on to any applications that are tied to their Azure Active Directory tenant. Before we start with the provisioning package experience walkthrough, let's take a quick look at the new version of Up School PCs that we are releasing with Windows 11. We will create a provisioning package that we will then use to enroll one of our devices. Here we are on a technician machine, and we have already installed the new version of Up School PCs from the Microsoft Store. We select the Get Started button. Here we select Next. We can provide a name for the provisioning package, and then we can sign in with an Azure Active Directory account so that a bulk token can be created in this tenant. After authenticating, we can select Next. We can then add a Wi-Fi network, accept, and select Next. We select which version of Windows we want to provision. For example, we select Windows 11, and we can specify additional customizations. For example, we can add an Azure Active Directory preferred tenant domain name to make it easier for our users to log in. We make some basic configurations. For example, we provide a device name with a prefix. And we don't need to configure too many settings here, because we will push most of these settings from Intune. For simplicity, we add also a couple of applications, for example, Minecraft and Company Portal. Pre-caching of applications will allow users to start using these applications without waiting for Intune to deliver them. We can customize the wallpaper and lock screen. And once we're ready, we select Accept. We then save the provisioning package to a USB stick. And now that we have our package ready, we can grab a device that is in the out-of-box experience and plug the USB stick in. Here we turn our device on, and as soon as the OOBE is ready, we can then plug the USB stick in. The device will be parsing the provisioning package that is stored on the USB device, and for example, the device is now renaming, joining Azure Active Directory, and enrolling in Intune. Eventually the device will reboot, and once all the settings and applications that have been configured on the package are applied to the device, we will then see the Windows login screen. Now Alison can sign in, and since the device is managed by Intune, any applications and settings that are configured in Intune will start to be applied. This process, like we saw in previous walkthroughs, may take a little bit of time, depending on how many settings you have in place. Note that this process of enrolling devices using a provisioning package is usually carried out by the IT staff, and devices are delivered to the users already enrolled. In our walkthrough, Alison signed into the device as soon as the enrollment completed, so not all applications and settings were on the device right away. If you want to improve the first end user experience by delivering a device that is fully configured, you could either keep the devices on the network a little while until all apps and settings are applied, or you may want to add an enrollment status page which prevents the device to load the user profiles until all applications are installed. The provisioning package enrollment process is very easy to implement, and at the same time, it provides great flexibility because we don't have any specific hardware dependencies. If the devices meet the minimum requirements of Windows 11, this process can be carried out on any device. Moving to the second walkthrough of corporate-owned devices without end-user interaction, here we're looking at Windows Autopilot Self-deploying mode. In this case, the device has been registered in Windows Autopilot and assigned a self-deploying mode profile. The device is turned on for the first time, and in this case, it is hardwired and already connected to the internet, which allows us to achieve a zero-touch provisioning experience. The device will fetch an Autopilot profile, automatically join Azure Active Directory on its own, and enroll in Intune, so no need for an end user to provide any credentials. In this scenario, we also configured an enrollment status page, which prevents the users from signing in until all applications and settings targeted to the device are installed. Like before, this process may take some time, depending on number of applications and settings configured. And this process can be either carried out by the IT department or potentially even an end user, letting the Autopilot provisioning process completing in front of the user. At the end of this process, our device is fully configured, making this an optimal experience for Alison, which is also very similar to the Autopilot pre-provisioning one. As Alison signs in, most of the applications and settings that she needs are already on the device. Other applications that may require the user profile to be loaded will install after the first sign-in. For example, here we see Teams and progressive web apps. Autopilot Self-deploying mode is an excellent choice for shared devices or kiosk scenarios. But, like Autopilot pre-provisioning, it requires the devices to meet certain hardware requirements, like TPM2 chipsets and the support for device attestation. This concludes the third and last part of this video, where we covered the userless enrollment of devices in Microsoft Intune. So let's now recap what we covered today. We started with the enrollment of personally owned devices by looking at modern app sign-in, add work or school account, and enrollment via company portal. Then we moved to corporate-owned scenarios. First, by looking at enrollments with user interaction with a standard out-of-box experience in Windows 11, then Windows Autopilot User-driven mode, and at the end, the enrollment with Autopilot pre-provisioning. For corporate-owned devices without user interaction, we looked at how to create a provisioning package using the new version of Up School PCs, then we provisioned the device with that same provisioning package. In the last walkthrough, we looked at Autopilot Self-deploying mode. Here are some resources for you. There are links to Microsoft Docs, links to previously released videos how to configure the Intune service to enable the scenarios described in these walkthroughs. Lastly, we have links to interactive guides. You can find all these links in the description below.